Thank you, Senator Kokoski-Moore. Senator Carr.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. Senator Kokoski-Moore's speech that I'll commend her for. I'm very pleased that she'll be able to bring a perspective to the Senate on these matters. I share her concerns about the development of the procurement policies in this country, matters that such concern that we actually took to the last election a series of revised proposals in regard to procurement issue, particularly in regard to matters relating to Australian industry capability. Now, I note the contrast in terms of the dynamics of Australian politics between the parties on this issue. Those that say there is no difference between the Labor Party and the Conservative parties in this country should look to this area, because it highlights the very substantial difference in approach. The Prime Minister, during the last election, spoke at length about the prospect of jobs and growth. It's a less audible proposition since that time. And of course, we saw just in recent days in this chamber the discussion about the purchase of Australian Army uniforms, which a contract entered into just last year by this government, when the Minister for Defence, in fact, was the senior minister in the portfolio. The contract was awarded to a company that was manufacturing in China. So the Australian dress uniform, which the government recently announced with great fanfare in terms of a display on this issue in Paris, did so in a manner which immediately aroused my concern, because there was no mention of where this uniform was being made. This brand new uniform, the government said, was of such important improvement. And when I pursued this matter with the Minister, she said this was a question of value for money. Now, it was an answer to a question which we've heard all too often in this place, and fundamentally highlights a misunderstanding of what that principle involves. Because it's not just a question of the price of the uniform, it's a question of what value for money actually means in these circumstances. Taxpayers receive value for money in the awarding of procurement contracts and should take into account the whole-of-life costs of a contract. That's the Labor Party's position. The whole-of-life costs need to be considered here, because it's not simply a matter of the immediate cost of a product being awarded to a low-wage offshore manufacturer. Domestic manufacturers employ Australians who pay Australian taxes, spend their wages in Australian shops and on other Australian products. They contribute to their local communities in a myriad of ways. And they buy homes, they pay rates, and they send their kids to Australian schools. And by doing these jobs, Australian workers maintain and extend the capability of Australian industry. It increases the capacity of enterprise in which they work to be able to tender for other contracts. And it makes Australian businesses more competitive in global markets. So in doing these things, workers and businesses that they employ are able to contribute to the growth of the Australian economy. The purchase of Chinese products for the Australian Army, for our soldiers, strikes me to be in contravention of those principles. And of course, there's a position which essentially sees the offshoring of Australian jobs. And on a suggestion by the Minister that this could be defended on the basis of value for money is risible, because it delivers jobs and growth not to Australia but to another country. The Minister asserted it was all about value for money, as I say. It would appear that the government didn't even consider exemptions to ensure Australian production, as the Labor government did when it came to the combat uniform. as it did by the Labor government when it came to the slouch hat. And it strikes me that this is a case that demonstrates a negligence, that these matters aren't put forward to ensure that there is a national interest test that applies. The problem here is it's a habit of thought that developments in procurement officers who pass on to others, and it goes up the chain to the point where nobody actually takes notice of the consequences of procurement, particularly for our defence products, and we're talking here about the uniforms for our soldiers, in a proposition which sends these production offshore. Now, this is described as value for money. It's a perverse undermining of the meaning of that term. It's stated, well, of course, that's our obligations under international trade treaties. That's not the case. Most of our trade agreements have explicit exemptions for defence and for small business. The government has the capacity, if it so chooses to exercise it, to ensure that procurement policy is actually in Australian interests, and it becomes a crucial element of our industry policy in this country. Now, I note the motion points out that Commonwealth procurement is in the range of $59 billion. And that's just in 1 year. With an economy with a diverse industrial base that is capable of generating high-skilled, high-wage jobs, the question of where the Commonwealth places its contracts is critical to the industrial development of the nation. And in an economy which is seeing increasing casualisation of employment and increasing numbers of people dependent upon the vagaries of the commodity market, is there any wonder that Australians are so concerned when Australian taxpayer dollars for the defence industries is being used in this way? So despite all the talk about innovation and creativity, which of course have marked the transfer between Mr Abbott and Mr Turnbull, a point that we acknowledge this week, the preference, in fact, when it comes to procurement, is not for a creative, innovative or agile Australia. It's for an Australia of narrow, blinkered vision, a little Australia, in which the government refuses to use its purchasing power to build the economic capabilities of the nation. This is a clear case where ideology prevails over the reality of economics as ordinary Australians experience it. So it's vital that the procurement guidelines for our government agencies prevent that sort of blinkered thinking when it comes to the determination of the spending of public money on public contracts. Agencies should be required, of course, to take into account the proper use of public money at all times. But value for money involves a process that ensures that we get genuine value for the use of the Australian dollar. We can't have money spent on inferior products, higher maintenance and replacement costs. The procurement guidelines need to ensure that agencies are required to consider all the direct and indirect costs, the whole of life costs of products. So let me quote directly from the Labor Party's national platform on this, where it says that Labor will adhere to the national interest test for government procurement policy by considering whole of life costs rather than the purchase price alone. We will ensure procurement policies that take into account the direct and indirect economic benefits of buying locally, including estimated taxation revenues, employment opportunities and industrial capability. Now that's the kind of assessment that we need in applying when it comes to the issues like an ADF uniform. Workers in Bendigo at the ADF, the Australian Defence Apparel, of course, were told by this minister that the new defence industry strategy would give particular emphasis to local capabilities. This is when she knew that the contract had already been issued to produce the uniforms, not in that factory, which of course is where it would have been normally the case, but in China. And that decision had been taken a year before she appeared before those workers. Kept secret, only recently revealed, because the government sought to make a show in Paris about a new uniform. Now what we know then is that the Australian government needs to ensure that we are able to develop capabilities, whether it be in the textile industry or whether it be in the steel industry, electronics, wherever it's necessary for us to procure products and where there is a local capability that's competitively priced, there ought to be an emphasis on the Australian government procurement arrangements to see under, and as we say, that we're actually ensure that Australian industry capability is actually advanced. Now we say there needs to be a national procurement coordinator to oversee the Commonwealth procurement practices. We say that contracts stipulate that worth of 20 million or more should be subject to an Australian industry participation plan. In fact, the last elections we proposed that be reduced to $10 million. The measures were intended to increase the opportunity for small and medium-sized enterprises to supply goods and services for the Australian government. We also say that we must be able to ensure that tender specifications were not written in such a way as to actually exclude Australian suppliers. Now, this is not about shielding Australian firms from competitive pressures. On the contrary, it's about ensuring that we do get some competitive pressures put into the system so that we can build the capabilities in Australia and ensure that the competitive process is fair. Not designed to exclude people, but to actually include people. And that, of course, it's not a matter of standing aside and letting the market rip. Because we know if you apply that policy, the market will determine an outcome, all right, but it won't be in Australia's favour. That's why Labor in government had a policy of buy Australia at home and abroad. A policy with a suite of measures to ensure that Australian producers got a fair go when it came to pursuing domestic work through government contracts. They included such things as supplier advocates for major projects, ensured that we actually properly used the industry capability network so that we actually knew what Australia could do, and that proponents for contracts understood this occurs not just in the public sector but in the private sector as well, so that companies that actually were trying to build products for use in this country knew what capabilities this country could provide. We have also have improvements in the enhanced project bylaws scheme, so that if people want a tariff concession for building in Australia, that is importing material, they had to have undertaken a proper study of what work could be done locally. We also advocate that there needs to be proper management assistance by building management capabilities through Enterprise Connect. We argue that supplier advocates across a range of sectors need to be put in place to assist small and medium-sized enterprises secure new contracts. Because frankly, in this world, the arrangements are put in place that actually, as I say, make it very difficult for local suppliers to bid for the work. There needs to be assistance provided to local companies so that they can be properly trained and put in the right position to be able to tender for work on a competitive basis. Now, under our $1 billion plan for Australian jobs, which we introduced in 2013, these measures, which were intended to promote Australian industry participation, were actually strengthened. We continually work on these principles because this is an area a bit like tax avoidance. No sooner do you put in place propositions to improve the integrity of administrative arrangements than some smarty comes along and finds a way to get around it. So you can't stand still here. Programs like this need to be adjusted to meet changes in economic conditions. The previous Australian industry participation was set at a time when there was much higher rates of private investment in mining and resources projects. And that's why we said at the last election the change in the circumstances mean that the threshold for private projects needs to be lowered. So we actually put in place support arrangements so that a project of $250 million rather than $500 million have these measures applied. That's why we said in the public sector projects need to be lowered from 20 million to 10 million. Now, it's an essential strategy and it requires governments to change attitudes about what is the role of government when it comes to the spending of public money on government contracts, but also what is the role of government encouraging large international firms who want to build in this country, very large projects that we've seen in recent times, the level of support that those companies should have to ensure that they use local suppliers, where they're available and where they have the capability to perform work properly. This is a government that says, basically let the market roll. They have a hands-off attitude. They take the view that if we have to get a defence uniform made in China, there's no big deal about that. They take the view that if the jobs are lost in Bendigo, that's not a problem. And anyone just has to look at what's happening about full-time employment in this country, particularly in manufacturing, knows how foolhardy that attitude is. The fact that in regard to our defence forces, that we can't even put the uniforms on people's backs made in Australia strikes me as something quite bizarre. Quite bizarre. And it is a government attitude that says that that circumstance is okay. Because the government has the capacity to say we want to ensure proper prices, competitive prices, whole-of-life costings, that these projects can be built in Australia. And the idea that we can't even make a uniform for our soldiers in Australia, I'd say, demonstrates the foolhardy attitude of this government that says the free market is the solution to our problems. It's an attitude that we will rue the day of. And if it's good enough to have our combat uniforms made here, it's good enough to ensure that the uniforms that our soldiers wear in other circumstances are made here as well. And it's particularly serious when it comes to the question of ensuring future competitive tenders. You undermine the capacity of our industry to compete by actually making sure the work goes offshore. So when the next contract comes along, the firm's not there to compete. And of course we're told, well, there's no one here that can do the work. And I notice in this case that there's a whole series of other contracts for uniforms in the Navy and the Air Force. And I'll be pursuing at estimates how it is that this contract has gone offshore, under what circumstances, and why there wasn't a national interest test put in place to ensure that we keep the industrial capabilities so important to this country's future in Australia.
Thank you, Senator Carr.